Excellent. Thanks very much, Naz. And thanks again to everybody at HPN and at HPG for helping out identify this need for a document that would provide in much shorter form some of the key dilemmas and key challenges that we think the organizations should be keeping in mind. If we could go to the first slide of mine, which I believe is slide number 19, starts previous research and analysis. Excellent. So next slide, please. So what I'm going to do in the next 8 to 9 minutes or so is really drill down into one of these key dilemmas that Naz mentioned, which is counterterrorism related contracts. I wanted to take a moment to say what exactly it is that is this dilemma, what it was that drove us to research this dilemma, and how we think organizations might try to consider how best to identify the concerns associated with these contracts, how they might think about them strategically and whatnot, just to provide a deep dive into one of these central dilemmas. So we found in a lot of discussions with humanitarian organizations and others that there was this huge proliferation of contracts that had some sort of counterterrorism related component to them. And we had built on all this research from HPN, from HPG, and from others saying that there were these countervailing norms that Naz laid out and that there were potential issues, but what exactly were they? People didn't seem to necessarily be getting prosecuted at high rates. There weren't a lot of highly documentable ways to identify the huge impact of these counterterrorism laws, but we saw that there was some sort of impact, especially when it came to these contracts, because there was mass confusion around what exactly was the content of the contract obligation, what you had to do to fulfill it, etc. So next slide, please. So we undertook a project to really try to dig in. We received funding from the Norwegian Refugee Council through the NMFA, and I need to acknowledge their support, but note that we were completely independent in our analysis. Next slide, please. In doing this project, we sought out to we tried to figure out what were the key issues for people actually making decisions at headquarters, at the regional level, at the national level, at the field level. So we did interviews in New York, DC, Geneva, Nairobi. We did many on the phone with over 4 dozen humanitarians, general counsels, etc. And next slide, please. We decided to really dig into the experience and then also the contracts themselves. So we got over 90 different counterterrorism related contract clauses, and they showed the huge diversity and multiplicity of concerns that these organizations are facing. What was interesting for us, of course, is that these donors, when we would talk to them, said, of course, we as donors have donors ourselves. We are receiving money from the US government or from the US taxpayer or the British taxpayer or our private donors also, and we need to be held accountable to them in some way too, to ensure that none of our aid and assistance, the funding is reaching terrorist organizations. Next slide, please. So very quickly, I'll do an overview of some of the key facets of these clauses. The main thing to keep in mind here as you're listening through, I think, is the diversity of them, the multiplicity of them that that organizations are trying to deal with, and what are the key ways you might try to think about how to negotiate the contracts, how to resolve any potential issues that could arise if something you're being asked to do might not completely align with a policy that your organization has, and how within your organization to work through these questions, which are probably not going away anytime soon. So in terms of obligations, we found a huge variety from international law sources to domestic law sources. A key point here on the domestic law sources is that we found primarily the United States, Canada, Australia, and the UK incorporating list checking requirements from their domestic law, but most other states did not include that. For example, Sweden or Norway. Importantly here, and if I might just take a really quick step back to say, what exactly is this contract? So most people, when they think of there's a contract, they think, oh, well, this is just a document that we sign and then we'll report back to the donor. A contract, of course, is a legal document in which you say, we will do or not do the things laid out in the contract. The contract is different in really important ways, though, from the underlying criminal law or the civil law that applies irrespective of the terms of the contract. You can contract into additional obligations, but you can't contract out of the underlying other criminal and civil obligations that your organization might have. Next slide, please. Some key characteristics we found were very different standards of efforts, or that some organizations were being required to adopt a certain political framing, which I'll give an example of later, and that there was a huge range of what's captioned under due diligence. So, everybody wants to ensure that they do whatever is necessary to make sure that their organizations comply with the contract, but what exactly did it mean to have due diligence? The short answer is that it often required certifying that you haven't supported terrorists or terrorism, and that you will undertake some sort of list checking exercise. But there's other forms as well. Next slide, please. So for this audience, I want to focus on six big observations, and then I'll get to some key questions and wrap up with some very quick overview of examples. The first big observation that I think is important for this audience is that in general, of the 4 people we interviewed, they seem to indicate that donors' risk tolerance is decreasing, that the donors are transferring some sort of their obligations for risk onto the humanitarian organizations, who then, in partnering with their subcontractors, are similarly transferring risk down the line. The second key observation is that within the diverse range of contract clauses we saw, the organizations that had the strongest negotiating position seem to be the ones that framed their language in terms of providing aid and assistance in principled manners, rather than being co-opted into the language of promoting counterterrorism or security in terms that the government or the other donors were trying to encourage them to adopt. Another key observation is that almost every organization we talked to said that they were drawing a red line at screening ultimate beneficiaries. And yet this didn't quite seem to align necessarily with all of the practice that we were hearing about. And it also, for us, raised questions about whether or not drawing a red line there actually fulfills the underlying legal obligation. Next slide, please. Similarly, we found that, and this was a very important one, and one I just want to emphasize for a moment, pooled funds and other large UN-based funding mechanisms have what we called a viral effect. So these clauses, these templates, are used by dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of organizations based on the way that the system is built. And it's really important to understand that with these templates, they are going to have force way beyond just the UN actors. The second to last point on the observation side is that, as many of the people in the audience will know, there's been a huge uptick in the amount of commercial software out there that's being used or being required to use. And this is just one of the many ways we see organizations needing to provide in-house training, in-house resources, additional administrative resources toward ensuring that none of their aid and assistance is intentionally reaching listed entities. And yet, many organizations are situated quite differently. If you're working out of headquarters, it's a very different thing to check a extremely large US or UK, Australia, Canadian counterterrorism list than it is if you're in the middle of somewhere such as Nairobi or elsewhere, where even internet connectivity might be much lower. The last general observation is that in general, we saw that there's a real potential disconnect, and we're very curious to hear the audience's perspectives on this, around whether there might be a divergence of views within the organizations regarding whether the obligations laid out in the contract are feasible if they align with the policies of the organizations and whatnot. The general counsels, for instance, on one hand would say this is very clearly the legal obligation that you have to meet. And then staff implementing the contracts oftentimes said that, well, we don't quite fully understand what this entails, why we necessarily need to do it for this, and how it might interface with the other list checking requirements that we have, and if it raises any staff security or other concerns. Next slide, please. We saw that in general, there are 4 big questions that humanitarian organizations seem to be facing when it comes to these clauses. And again, this is just one of the many areas where counterterrorism might affect humanitarian response. So the first one, is there or should there be an attempt to identify industry-wide counterterrorism standards? If so, should it be framed in terms of counterterrorism standards? Should it be framed in terms of pro-beneficiary standards or principled humanitarian action standards? The next point being, should you, as a person in the field, person at the regional office, person at headquarters talking with donors or others, actually seek more clarity, or would you benefit more from having this level of constructive ambiguity between what exactly is entailed? Third, is there and should there be attempts to identify and enforce red lines? I mentioned that there seems to be an emergence of a potential red line around screening ultimate beneficiaries. Is that really a red line? Are you willing to actually enforce that? Would you be willing to withdraw from funding if that actually came to pass? And the fourth one is, how should organizations be developing their systematic and thoughtful responses to these concerns? Should it be at headquarters primarily, where there may be legal staff, though there might not be? Should it be a coordinating mechanism among the national staff? Should it be at the field level? Who should have a say in doing this? And should this actually be taking that many resources? I won't go through all of the different clause examples. I do, though, want to focus on the first one. So we go to the next slide. This is the most standard example that you'll see. It requires to organizations to say, we have not in the last 10 years, and we will not provide any resources to terrorism. Next slide. The last one that I want to mention is, I think, an example that has a little positive daylight, if you will. This organization and all of the organizations that we received these contracts from were anonymously provided, so we didn't indicate who the organization was. But this organization actually negotiated terms that are quite different from many of the other ones. And they reference the Geneva Conventions. They reference a little bit different level of effort. They reference how what the programs are designed to do, even if it might not necessarily always meet that objective. Again, whether or not this fulfills the criminal law standards or the civil law standards, it definitely frames the contract terms in a way that might be much more susceptible to what could be considered traditional approaches to more principle-based humanitarian engagement than some of the other ones, or not. So with that, I'll end by just saying that contract clauses are by no means the only concern for these organizations. They seem to be, for the organizations we talked to, the most pressing one because they represent the most difficult multiplicity of different obligations, and you're hearing from different people negotiating different terms, a lot of difference happening. And yet, know that you're not alone in doing this. Everybody's dealing with this right now, and there are ways that you can educate yourself, your organization, and engage in discussions at the level of the humanitarian community. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Sarah.